we really couldn't cut off at any point. It's this really pivotal story that is really important to what we've been talking about for the last several weeks together. So for those of you that are joining us on this final sermon in a 5-part series, sorry. Sorry that you weren't here in the preceding 4 installments as we have sort of built a premise upon which we are sort of delivering this idea. But if you could just go to the second slide, one more. What we've been talking about during the course of this whole series is the ideas around how people access God. And in particular, a transition from thinking about accessing God in a specific place, and we can go to the next slide here, in a specific kind of faraway place, the temple. You have to go to a certain place, and if you're lucky, that's where you'll find God. And once you're there, then you're going to encounter all the people with the right roles and titles. And those people with the roles and titles, they know how to access God. And if you go and approach them in the right way, maybe they'll grant access to God. And they have all the right tools and rituals and all the right words to say in order for everybody to sort of be able to access God. And we've said that in the New Testament, sort of under the tutelage of Jesus, there has been this move away from what I'm calling temple thinking towards table thinking. And the proliferation and democratization of access to God. From special places, special people, special tools, to everyday places, everywhere, with every kind of person, at the most common of places, the table. So that's what we did over sort of 4 installments, and we looked at each one of those things. And we're going to draw it all and wrap it all up here today. Next slide. So, if access to God is for everybody at every place and in every way, frequently sometimes people wonder, well, why even share the story of Jesus? What role does Jesus have to play in all of this? And how do we actually access Jesus? And so much of the church's thinking around things like proselytization and in sharing the things about Jesus that they find meaningful, there's been this tension about, well, what does it mean to worship Jesus then if we've lost all of these religious boundaries? So here's a hypothetical that I've run into as I've invited people to consider what it means to follow Jesus. Okay? So, imagine somebody doesn't follow Jesus and they're asked or they're introduced to Jesus and they're thinking about potentially following Jesus. They'll say something like this in our very good, open, pluralistic society that we've all come to love and appreciate in Canada, and that is really important. They'll say things like this: if I, for the sake of argument, say yes to Jesus, does that mean that I've just drawn lines between myself and my friends, those who don't share that yes? My Buddhist and atheist and Jewish and just plain secular friends. Because if saying yes to Jesus means saying no to them, well, that would be a very unhappy place. Now, remember where we've been over the course of the last 4 sermons. For centuries, that was precisely what it meant for many people when they decided to follow Jesus. All of Christian history is sort of rooted in this fact that if you follow Jesus, there are really tight boundaries around you that now sort of cloister you off from the rest of the world. Just think over the course of Christian history, which is the last 2,000 years, frequently, when you made the decision to follow Jesus, there were some very clear lines of demarcation between who was in and who was out. Now, notice in the chapter that Kelly so graciously read, did you get a glass of water? I hope you did, because I know how your mouth gets dry when you talk and you go through that. Next slide. In Acts 15, this chapter that Kelly just read for us, there was this pivotal moment in time. This is like this historical slice of the pie. And the book of Acts goes to great lengths to describe the encounter around who was going to be allowed to come to God, who was going to be allowed to access God, who was going to be allowed to be sort of part of the wider workings of God in this world, and who was going to be out. And there was these very clear lines of demarcation between who was in and out. You probably noticed the word Gentiles showed up several times in the reading. Well, what was a Gentile? Does anybody know what a Gentile was? Sorry? That's right, a non-Jew, right? Somebody who didn't biologically, genetically identify as part of the Jewish community. And because the early Christian movement, at this point in the book of Acts, there was no Christian church. There were no basilicas, no bishops, no priests, no pastors. There were no elders. There were no denominations. All of the things that we have come to understand over the course of the last 2,000 years regarding what Christianity is and some of the boundaries in place. Oh, there's that series of Christians over there, and they got started in that country, and they meet in these kinds of places. And you can see it. You can see all the different ways that Christianity has sort of evolved over the course of the last 2,000 years. But in Acts 15, none of that exists. So we have to kind of put ourselves back in that milieu of a group of people who have made a decision about something they believe, and there are now tensions between who's in and out, and who's following, and what does it mean to follow. And at this point, the only thing that Christianity is known as is the title, The Way. What are they known as? The Way. What does that conjure up when you hear the phrase, the way? Any ideas? What do you think of when you hear the way? You think of a path, maybe? You think of a journey? You think of going somewhere? You think of maybe instructions? Maybe you think of a map? The way. This is the way. And that's what the followers of Jesus were known as in the early articulations of what it meant to follow Jesus. Oh, they were simply people of the way, the people that followed Jesus. So, next slide, please, Shayla. In Acts chapter 15, verse 10, so early on in the story, the key leaders of the way are trying to figure out how things are going to operate. And there was, because the community was now becoming mixed with people from all around and all walks of the Mediterranean life, and all walks of the Roman Empire, and people were coming from different tribes and different places, and they were all beginning to espouse faith in Jesus. And yet, the beginnings of this was sort of rooted in Jewish identities and what it meant to kind of figure out all of those differences. And so, the leaders of the way said, now therefore, why are you putting God to the test by placing a yoke on the neck of the disciples that neither our fathers nor we have been able to bear? So, in essence, there is this idea that if we continue down this road of really clear distinctions between who's in and who's out, this has made it very difficult for our families. This has made it very difficult for our ability to serve our neighbors. This has made it very difficult for us because who was in and who was out was very clearly articulated. And what the leaders are saying is, yeah, we really want everybody to know who Jesus is. But we've got some walls. We've got some boundaries that it's hard to get up and over those walls. It's hard to get up and into these places. And we've got to find a way to level the playing field. We've got to figure out a way to make this more accessible. What's the whole sermon series about? Access to God. They're saying, listen, if we keep doing certain things, access to God is going to be really hard. So how do we fix it? Next slide, Sheila. To reiterate it, it is my opinion, James went on, that we should not trouble the Gentiles who are turning to God. Now, listen, I've got to put my heart on my sleeve here a little bit. I think there's tons of value in knowing Jesus and following Jesus. But as I sit as a religious leader, and as I sit thinking about what Christianity has done over the course of the last 2,000 years, my Christian history, all of the denominations, all of the various ways, nobody's innocent in this. Christianity hasn't always made following Jesus very easy. When we ask people to follow Jesus or to consider the teachings of Jesus or to consider the pathway that Jesus sort of lays out in front of us and says, hey, this is a great way to encounter the world, I think frequently Christianity has put up quite a few obstacles. Now, one of the reasons I'm very happy to plant my flag within the United Church denomination is that when I look at what the United Church denomination stands for, I see some of the lowest, some of the boundaries. I don't even know if you can call them speed bumps. We've done a really good job of laying low, etc. And what I want to encourage us to do is to remember that while we've done actually a really good job of putting into practice what Acts 15 is all about, putting down the walls, we still need to remember that we're putting down the walls and we're creating paths to somebody. We're creating paths to Jesus. So I want to talk a little bit about group dynamics. Next slide. Next slide. We'll skip that one. Okay. So, historically speaking, the last 2,000 years, this is how Christianity has operated. Sadly, frequently at threat of the sword. Okay, so just think of the Crusades. Does anybody remember what the Crusades were? What were the Crusades? Christian people from parts of Europe would sort of make their way through Europe and the Middle East, and they would say, believe in Jesus or die. And back and forth, various religions over the course of the 2,000-year history of Christianity would push back against each other, and at the threat of the sword, they would say, espouse faith in Jesus, and you'd say, I believe in Jesus, because you're afraid of dying. And then they would say, okay, well, here's what it means. You go to church on Sundays, you do this, you take communion, etc. You behave like us. And if you believe in Jesus and you behave like us, well, then you belong. Then you can have a place here. So historically speaking, that's how it operated. Yay or nay? This is how it operated. I can tell you. The history books will tell you. This is how it operated. Now, next slide, Sheila. This is kind of what sort of happened. What do you need to believe in? You need to believe in the Messiah. That would be Jesus. Then you have to behave religiously. Do what religious people do. And if you believe in the Messiah and you behave religiously, you can be an insider. You can be part of the crew. Okay, next slide. I just want to change two words. The difference between belong and believe in the sequence. Okay? What happens when Christianity's posture becomes first and foremost a posture of hospitality and welcome and belonging? That before all else, you belong to God. This is where Christianity is today, and I think the United Church and some of what we stand for, and some of, I think, the best ways in which theological thinkers are beginning to wonder about what it means to follow God in this world, is we're saying, no, the table is a place of belonging. The table is a place of belonging. Remember, the temple was hard to access. First and foremost, you had to believe that God was over there, and then you had to behave, bring the right sacrifices, and do the right things to the right people, and then if you were just lucky enough, you'd be allowed into that space. It changes everywhere. What happens in Christianity then, and what the rest of the whole thing is about is saying, no, just come to my home, be a part of my family, be a part of my life, sit at my table, eat my food, just talk to me. I want to love on you. And then we're going to serve the world. The behavior becomes about service to the world, not about religious rituals, but about serving the world. That's the behavior that we're looking for, love. And then ultimately, because we have found welcome, and because we see the benefits of serving, we then maybe begin to believe that God is good. Are you following here? Are you following? So what ends up happening is the belief comes at the end. We figure out what we believe about God based on our experiences with the community. Next slide, Shayla. So I've got it lined up here. Believe, belong, behave, belong, believe. So old school religious thinking, temple thinking, you have to believe first, then behave properly, and maybe you'll get a chance to be a part of us. Table thinking, Jesus thinking is, you belong. I'm here. You are mine. Altogether and forever, I love every single person. There's not a person on this planet I don't love. And I invite you to follow the way. I invite you to follow the way of love. And hopefully maybe you'll find a way to talk about who and what God is to the rest of the world. You'll believe. Next slide, Sheila. Okay. So I wanted to give you some pictures. And this is a theory. For any of you interested in reading about the theories, you can look it up on Google. I'm going to talk about the difference between boundary groups, what was the theoreticians called bounded sets, versus center sets. Okay, so right here there's a very strong wall. There's no perforations, etc. And in that circle, there are these blue boxes, and in those boxes I've placed words that have frequently been boundaries, walls, that we have placed as markers and demarcations around us in order to keep us safe so that we know who's in the circle and who's outside of the circle. Okay. So, denominations, your style of worship, whether or not you go to church, how you pray, your lifestyles, the rituals you engage in, the language you choose to use around God, health, the Bible, what you believe about the Bible, how orthodox are your beliefs? And if you say the right things and do the right things in all the right ways, then we'll open the door to the circle, we'll let you in, and we'll quickly close the door. So that's the bounded set. Next slide. Here, there is no wall. There are no boundaries. What we find is arrows. I want to call them pathways. Remember, Christianity was called the way. It was called the way. It was like a journey. And all we have is something in the center. And in that center, it doesn't matter how far you are out in the corners, you can see the center. Nothing is blocking your vision of the center. This is so key, people. When we put walls up, etc., and people are like, well, I don't know what's behind there. I don't even know if I want to gaze over there. So when we put the walls down and we point in ways and arrows, things like trust, beauty, being other-centered, being selfless, the acts of forgiveness and love, these are just a smattering of ways that I think line up with Jesus, the gospel, and the good life. So this is a center, and we have pathways that Jesus laid down and said, we think these pathways lead to life. Next slide, Shayla. Further out, further away from the center are a few other activities, and these activities may feel and look a little bit more religious, but they're not walls. They're not walls. If we make them walls, then we're defeating the purpose. But worship, liturgy, service, lifestyle, church, those things can also be pathways rather than walls. Here, we still have just a centered set, no boundaries. We have pathways, and all of them we believe are leading to life, leading to Jesus. Next slide. So the premise then, the culminating thing in the life of Jesus, the culminating thing in the movement from temple to table thinking, is that all of those things that used to be walls, blocks, or obstacles now are laid flat, and they simply become paths and directions. And to the degree that they point to Jesus is the degree to which they are good maps. And if they're pointing a little bit away from Jesus and we see the path and the journey, we say, well, that doesn't seem to line up with what I see at the center. At the center, I see the beautiful picture of God, the life-giving love of God, the forgiveness of Jesus, the open arms, the wide embrace of Jesus. And if any of those paths don't seem to be pointing to a very clear picture of what we know of God in Jesus, then those are bad maps. Those are bad pathways. That's not the way, if you will. There are lots of ways. So next slide. Okay, so there can be other centers, right? For many of us, our center is ourselves. And there are a lot of pathways that lead to self or false gods, right? You can see them there. Bigotry, destruction, hurt, isolation, hate, revenge, selfishness, addictions, racism, the rat race of life, chaos, greed. All of these kinds of paths lead to something other than Jesus. They lead to pain and hurt, to death. They lead to fighting words. And what we don't want to know, what we don't want to do is follow these pathways. These pathways, we see where they've led. Over the course of history, we've seen where these kinds of pathways lead. So we don't want that at the center. We want something else at the center because that helps orient our pathways. Next slide. When we align ourselves with Jesus, we find that Jesus is sort of pushing against racism, pushing against revenge and hate, pushing against bigotry, pushing against greed, and trying to say, nah, those pathways don't lead to life. Those pathways lead to hurt and to pain and to isolation. Next slide. So Jesus got mad consistently at the ultimate line drawers, the religious leaders of his day. And this is what the early apostles and the early church faced. There were people that wanted to see things a certain way, and they wanted lines drawn and walls erected because it made them feel safer. It made them feel safer. It's safer when we know who's in and who's out. But God is inviting us to see the transition. Jesus is inviting us to see the transition. Next slide. What Jesus is asking us to do is to point in a new way of life. And that we're turning away from those ways that lead to death and to other things, and instead we are seeing all of our attempts at following Jesus as simply safe paths, low paths, paths that mark the way to life. They're not walls, they're not obstacles, and in various ways over the course of time, these various things that we do as Christians will liven us up and help us to know and see who is Jesus. So back to the original question. The original question in the sermon was, if I say yes to Jesus, does that mean I have to say no to everybody else? Does that mean I have to have a wall between me and my friends? Me and the rest of the religious community? Me and the rest of the people I encounter? Does saying yes to Jesus mean walls between us? And my answer is simply no. Only if we see Jesus' teachings and the followings of Jesus as walls that are impenetrable, and we treat them as such, that we find ourselves at loggerheads with our friends. Instead, we can see the continuum of what it means to follow God and follow the way of love. For Christianity, the center is Jesus. For Christianity, the center and the definition of the good life, the healthy life, the connected life, the fulfilled life, the meaningful life, we find in the person of Jesus. We find in the things that Jesus stood for and said and taught and demonstrated in his life. But those are not walls and obstacles. Those are pathways. And so, as we journey along in this world with everybody else from every other way of life, we can talk about our maps. And we can talk about our journeys and our pathways and where we're headed. And we can talk about it in life-giving ways. We can share insights on this journey of life. We can say, here's where I'm headed. I'm headed this way, and here's why I'm walking this road. I'm walking this road because it feels good to love those who the world finds difficult to love. And I love those people because Jesus taught me to do that. Let me give you a really clear example. The United Church decided that the LGBT community was welcome. The rest of the world marginalized them, said, nope, here's a wall, here's a line of demarcation, you're not allowed in. No way, that's not what my religious community looks like. And the United Church said, well, hang on a second. Our center is Jesus. What do we know about life centered in God in the way of Jesus? Jesus opened his arms, opened his heart to everybody. And at the time and the day and age, the outcasts, the marginalized were allowed in. Jesus took the religious leaders and took the obstacles in the way, and he flattened them. And he said, no, if you're coming to follow me, nothing's going to stand in the way. You're welcome to the table. Come to my table. I'll feed you free. And everything was lowered and made accessible. This is all that I'm calling us to. All that it means to follow and to turn from temple thinking to table thinking is to flatten the path and make the path accessible and open to all, so we can all see and know where Jesus is, so that we can have a vision, a clear vision of who Jesus is. I hope that has been an interesting way for us to both situate ourselves today as a church, to think about the history of the Christian church, and to think about where we need to be as a faith.